All right, let's try this afternoon. Good evening or good afternoon to you. I'm a little fearful of going Facebook Live, but I thought I would make a little brief video of a devotion. A couple of our folks have been asking me to do that, and so I wanted to try to be a blessing and a help this afternoon. I want to take a look at a verse of Scripture in 1 Kings 19, verse number 4. The prophet Elijah says, "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." And in this verse, I see very clearly that Elijah has fainted. And so that's what I want to talk about for a moment this afternoon. And Elijah's fainting. In this verse, we're told here that he had come down and sat under a juniper tree, and there now he is asking God to take his life away from him. And so in his fainting, we can't fault Elijah, because you and I both know that all of us at one time or another have failed, it seemed, and have grown weary in well-doing. All of us have wanted to quit at one time or another. At some time we have found our position not to be satisfying, or our success not to be what we thought it was going to be, or whatever. And this has happened to Elijah now as well. And we find here, I remind you now, by the way, that Elijah was a great man of God. Elijah was a man that God had anointed, God called, God had comforted, God had taken care of, and God had blessed in a tremendous way, in so many ways. But yet and still we find that he was ready to give up. And he gave up too quickly. And sometimes you and I find ourselves willing to give up too quickly. But what was the cause of Elijah's fainting that day? I think there are several elements that are involved here, and I want to share my thoughts with you this afternoon. The causes for Elijah's despondency, or his fainting, was, first, I think that the man was just literally physically tired. And there's no doubt about it, my friend. When you get physically exhausted, you don't feel like doing anything else. And there comes a time in the battle to where you do get exhausted. And Elijah had come to that place in his battle. I mean, he was exhausted because he had been running from Jezebel, the wicked queen, and then he had been on the mountaintop and prayed and seen the fire of God fall. He had slain 850 false prophets. I mean, he had been everything that he needed to be to everyone that he needed to be that to for the last little while. But then not only that, but secondly, he wanted someone to feel pity for him. I think Elijah wanted someone to feel sorry. And I say that because of what he says. He comes to that verse where he said, even I alone am left. And he's like saying to you and I, and maybe you and I have said this too, you know what? Nobody else is serving God like I am. Nobody else is doing what I'm doing. Nobody else is putting themselves out there like I'm doing. I'm doing it all, it seems. And yet and still Elijah had come to that place that he had poured himself out to the Lord and to the people around him. And to think of all that he had done, and now he'd come to this place here that he was ready to fail and falter. But God told him to get up and go on, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But God was willing to overlook this at this particular time. But let me say thirdly this afternoon too as well, Elijah thought his work was finished. He'd come to that place. He'd been a long time prophet of God. He had done many mighty works for the Lord. There's no doubt about that. His time was finished as far as he was concerned. He had done what God wanted him to do. And so now he approaches the fact that he's ready to faint and give up, ready to die. I have nothing else left to do. And beloved, that is one of the worst things you can ever get to or do in your life, is get to the place to where you feel like you have nothing else to do, and no one else to help, and nothing else for God's glory to accomplish in this life. That's not so. But then the fourth thing that I want to share with you is Elijah's disappointment that his expectation of success was not met. I imagine Elijah had set a high bar for himself, and Elijah was disappointed that he had not accomplished all of that. But as we think back over his life over the last just little while, what I see is Elijah had seen great victory at Mount Carmel, with a fire coming down from heaven and devouring the sacrifice. I see that he had defeated the wicked prophets of Jezebel and Baal. I see that he had silenced the voice of false religion. He had put down the false worship of other gods in his territory there. He had put down, my friend, all that needed to be put down as far as evil was concerned. And yet he had been obedient to God in every point that he could be obedient to. And the brightest picture, though, that Elijah had was coming to the place to where it was all annihilated in one day. I mean, the very fact of what he thought was going to be a tremendous success has now brought him to a position that it seems like he has failed, and he is now fainting. And so we find Elijah, the man of God, sitting on a juniper tree and saying to God, "Take my life. I'm ready to die. It is enough." And God says back to him, No, son, that's not it." See, what God did for Elijah is the same thing God will do for you and I. And that is this: first, he'll build his strength physically. You notice that what God did for Elijah was he rested him. He gave him the physical rest that he needed. He gave him the food that he needed. All the material things that he had to have, God met them for this man of God. How God fed him twice a day from even the king's table was what a great blessing. God gave him sleep and physical rest in his body, and so that built him up, ready to make a 40-day journey. The second thing God did was to calm his heart and to calm his mind. Do you see, beloved, a lot of times when we get our minds in a turmoil, our heart gets in a turmoil as well. When we do not understand things, we do not have control over things, then we find ourselves in a position that we don't want to go on. But God calmed Elijah's heart and mind. We see that Elijah had come to the mouth of the cave. He had saw the thundering storm roll in, but God was not in that. He had heard the thunder, saw the lightning, but God was not in that. He had seen the fire, and God was not in that. He felt the earthquake and the rocks break apart, but God was not in that. And then all of a sudden, through a still small voice, God calmed the heart of Elijah. And he asked him the very serious question, "Elijah, what doest thou here?" Do you see, beloved, we see God has caused Elijah to feel the very seriousness of life. He has introduced him to the matter that I'm not done with you yet. And I believe many of us would have that same thought if we would think about it for a moment. Beloved, listen to this thought and listen to this old preacher real careful. Life is for doing. Life is not for sitting around. Life is not for just waiting and not doing anything. Life is for doing. And Elijah was not doing. He was mourning and moping and pitying himself. And he was not doing. He was being selfish. Life is too short not to use it for the glory of God. Life is for doing. And so God told Elijah, what doest thou here? Remember, he had already told him, I've got 7,000 that's never bent a knee to Baal. They've never prayed to him. They've never surrendered to him. I've got 7,000 over here. God was saying to Elijah, I'll tell you what, let's make that 7,001. Elijah, let's go do something for God. And I know, my friend, that days are difficult. Days are hard. Days are trying and troublesome. But the one thing about it is, God is still the same. He's the same God of Elijah that he is of you and I. He's the same God that delivered Elijah and will deliver you and I. He is the God that was ready in Elijah's day, and he is the God that is ready in our day to listen to our cry and answer our prayer and help us in our trust of him. So look to him today and depend upon what he can do for you. I trust that these words this afternoon have been an encouragement and a help, and maybe just a little bit of a nudge to pray and seek God's face. A little bit of a nudge to look to him and depend on God. God bless you. Our prayers are for you, and I know the Lord is able to carry us through, and we will be back under the roofs of our churches in just a little short more time. But until then, let's keep trusting God, keep walking with the Father, staying in the light of him, and he will bless. God bless you.